Good afternoon, everyone. I get in the time-honored academic and public affairs tradition of people standing up to introduce people who will then introduce people. I am going to just introduce Chris Paxson, Professor Chris Paxson, who is the head of the Center for Health and Wellbeing, Professor of Economics and Public Affairs, and I introduced her yesterday to our advisory committee by telling them that when we did a review of the Center for Health and Wellbeing last year, the reviewers, who were drawn from multiple different schools, came to me and said, the Center for Health and Wellbeing is a model of what such a center should be, and Chris Paxson is indispensable to having created it and making it what it is. So we're delighted to have the center host this panel and to have Chris chair the panel. Thanks.
Good, thanks for coming today. The topic I'm Chris Paxson, welcome. The topic today is access to antiretrovirals for HIV and how activism has translated into political action. Now, over the past couple years, we have done a number of events related to HIV/AIDS, lectures, seminars, things like that. Usually the debate is on issues of pricing, issues of distribution, intellectual property issues. So people are concerned with how to get ARVs out, and that's a really important question. Today, though, we're going to do something a little bit different, which is to have a discussion of the role that activism has played in the rollout of ARVs and in the response to the HIV/AIDS crisis. So the questions that I want to focus on today are things like, how has AIDS activism developed in different countries? Why has it developed differently in different places? What are the successes and failures of activism over the past 20 years? And although the experience of HIV/AIDS is in itself really important, can we draw any lessons from the past 20 years to apply to other types of epidemics and health problems that we see around the world? What I'm going to do is I'm first going to introduce the speakers. We're going to keep this really casual. I'll introduce the speakers. They're going to spend about 5 minutes each telling you about their backgrounds and what they do and give a brief introduction to the topic. And then I'm going to pose a set of questions to them and just have more informal discussion. We're going to reserve a lot of time at the end for discussion and questions from the floor. So that's the plan. So let me just introduce everybody all at once, and I'll introduce them in the order in which I'm going to ask them to do their opening talk. The first is Jennifer Cates, who's sitting on the end there. Jen received her MPA from the Woodrow Wilson School. She concentrated in demography. She just told me she's going back and working on a PhD. She also has a master's degree in political science. She has been involved in HIV/AIDS issues for 15 years. First as a senior associate with the Lewin Group, more recently as director of HIV-related policy at the Kaiser Family Foundation. So a lot of really relevant experience for this topic. João Biehl, who's just on my left, is an associate professor of anthropology here at Princeton. He received his PhD in anthropology from Berkeley, went from there to do an NIMH postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard, and then came here. A lot of his research is concerned with issues of health and medicine in Brazil, and he has a new book coming out very soon, I think. Princeton University Press is producing it, and it's called Will to Live, AIDS Therapies and the Politics of Survival, and it's concerned with the rollout of AIDS treatment in Brazil. Evan Lieberman, who is right there, is an assistant professor of politics at Princeton. His PhD is also from Berkeley. He's been a Fulbright Fellow in South Africa, a Robert Wood Johnson policy scholar at Yale. His research focuses on the causes and consequences of mobilized identities and the formation of public policy in developing countries. He's focused on issues like HIV/AIDS as well as tax policy. He is completing a book that will also be published by Princeton University Press. They have very good taste. And this is called Boundaries of Contagion, and it's on the politics of government responses to AIDS around the world. Our last panelist is David Barr, and I'm very pleased to have him. I think this is his first trip to Princeton, so welcome. He is the director, currently the director of the Collaborative Fund for HIV Treatment and Preparedness. David has a very, very long involvement with treatment advocacy and education in the U.S., I could spend a long time reading his bio, but it's very impressive. He's been involved since the earliest stages of the HIV epidemic. He's been the Director of Treatment Education and Advocacy at Gay Men's Health Crisis, the Chief Operating Officer of the Drug Policy Alliance, a founding member of ACT UP, and a member of ACT UP, and a founding member of the Treatment Action Group, as well as a number of other things. So it's a good panel. I will have, I guess we agreed Jen will go first, yeah? Why don't you come up here just for the first, yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I first want to thank you, Chris, and thank all of you for being here. We know we're competing with quite a nice day outside, and it's a Friday, but clearly this is an important topic, and from what you heard, a lot of us here have been working on this issue from different perspectives for a very long time. As Chris mentioned, I'm at the Kaiser Family Foundation based in our Washington, D.C. office, and just a couple words about Kaiser Family Foundation just to help you understand what I do. We are a nonprofit, private operating foundation, not at all affiliated with Kaiser Permanente or any Kaiser industry at all. We do independent policy research and media and communications on health issues, and I focus on HIV. I've been there for about 9 years, a little more than 9 years, doing HIV policy work. But I've been working on HIV issues beyond my work experience for almost 20 years. And I think relevant to the topic today, the way I became involved in and pulled into wanting to focus basically my entire professional and much of my personal life and time on this epidemic was personal reasons, knowing people, friends who were sick, who were dying. And I think that's a very defining aspect of this, what we're talking about today, was that personal relationship to what was happening around me and really in the streets of seeing people respond and also knowing people who weren't getting what they needed. And that drew me into it. And in fact, after doing community level work for several years, I explicitly came to the Woodrow Wilson School to get my MPA, knowing that I wanted to do HIV policy work. And just to put it a little bit in perspective, at that time, which was 93 to 95, I was the only student in the PhD program. I wasn't in the PhD program, but including PhD students and MPA students who was focusing on HIV. Nobody else was. And now there's a Princeton AIDS initiative. I get calls all the time from students who are doing a very exciting HIV work, so a lot has changed. But I also thought it would be helpful to set the stage a little bit back to when treatment activism around HIV began in this country, or activism, really. And to think about what in some ways is a very long history of this epidemic, but it's really short. If you think back to 1981, when the first cases of what we now know are AIDS were identified. It wasn't until 1984 that we even had identified the virus that causes AIDS. So there were several years where we didn't know a lot about what was happening. A test for HIV wasn't available until 1985. And the first antiretroviral, which, as you may or may not know, antiretrovirals are used in combination today, are the standard of care for many people with HIV. Not every person with HIV should be on antiretrovirals, but many should. And they have been responsible for significantly lowering mortality and morbidity rates wherever there's been access. But the first antiretroviral, AZT, wasn't approved until 1987. So if you think about it, almost the entire first decade that this was in our midst, there was nothing. There was a void. There was a void in available treatments, and there was a real lag in when our government even began responding. And that was the context. That was the time in which activism, and I think we'll get into some of these issues, in the form of people who were being affected, filled that void and took on a new identity, borrowing both from traditional social movement and civil disobedience, historical activism, as well as some new, I think, unique elements. And that set the stage for research activism, which led eventually to treatment activism. And it really has been responsible for changing the way, first, our government was organized to do research, to do clinical trials, to approve drugs, whether it's changes at FDA, at NIH, at CDC, some pretty amazing changes that now are just the way business is done, to what the implications of that were for the international realm, which is much more complex and varied. And David is working in several different countries on treatment activism, so brings a lot of wealth of information about different country experiences. I think I will stop there and leave it at that, but I just wanted to paint that picture for you. And for those of you who are interested in that history, we have on our website a timeline of key events, key issues, and dates related to the HIV epidemic going back to 1981, and you can actually go and see this story develop yourselves. It includes international as well as domestic moments in time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chris, for the invitation to participate in this panel, and also thank you for being here today. In the book, A Bias for Hope, economist Albert Hirschman argues that those concerned with wider social and economic transformation ought to engage the unexpected. The study of how attitudes and values are refashioned and molded by what he calls more or less accidentally undertaken practices widens, and that's his words, the limits of what is or is perceived to be possible, be it at the cost of lowering our ability, real or imaginary, to discern the probable. At stake is helping to defend people's right to a non-projected future and to set the stage for conceptions of change to which, and these are Hirschman's words, the inventiveness of history and a passion for the possible are admitted as vital actors. Well, Brazil has made history in the field of AIDS. Against all odds, in 1996, it became the first developing country to universalize access to AIDS therapies, a breakthrough made possible not just by professional politicians, but by an unexpected alliance of activists, government reformers, development agencies, and the pharmaceutical industry. Current estimates suggest that about 600,000 Brazilians are infected with HIV, and that about a third of them are taking ARVs paid for by the government. According to the Health Ministry, both AIDS mortality and the use of AIDS-related hospital services have subsequently fallen by 70%. The Brazilian drug rollout has become an inspiration for international activism and a challenge for the governments of other poor countries devastated by the AIDS pandemic. To understand the radically different world of AIDS post-treatment access in Brazil, I undertook a twofold investigation of how therapeutics mixes with politics, both nationally and globally, and on the circuits of care that enable AIDS patients to extend their lives amid poverty and the concomitant decentralization and dismantling of public health care services. And I actually began this ethnographic work on the Brazilian response to AIDS, called by an activist organization in Rio de Janeiro who wanted me to travel throughout Brazil in 1992 to see what was happening at a grassroots level. And that was the year that the World Bank began to fund the Brazilian AIDS program. And I returned several times to Brazil to travel throughout the country. And actually in 1992, I was fortunate to be in Salvador, in the northeastern part of Brazil, when a group of marginalized poor AIDS patients squatted in an abandoned hospital. And they founded their own health organization, their own proxy healthcare service. And I returned over time to work with them and to see how they got entrenched in local politics and in national politics. They became an NGO. They were funded by the World Bank. So in 96, 97, I did a year of fieldwork in Bahia. And at that time, the antiretrovirals became available. So I became very intrigued in trying to see what the antiretrovirals would make to them as a community and individually. So I have been following them until last year. So, and that's basically the book Will to Live is this longitudinal study of this community of marginalized AIDS patients now with access to antiretrovirals and how we see larger institutions and processes at work from this grassroots perspective. And in the book, in the beginning of the book, Will to Live, I show how throughout the 90s, AIDS activists and progressive health professionals migrated into state institutions and actively participated in policy making. And that was a differential. Many progressive health professionals were already working at a regional level, trying to create local responses to HIV/AIDS, while the national government was not. But in the beginning of the 90s, with a change in government, with the World Bank funding, those activists, they brought their know-how to the national program. They showed creativity into the design and prevention work, design of prevention work, and audacity in solving the problem of AIDS treatment. After framing the demand for access to ARVs as a human right, in accordance with the country's constitutional right to health, activists lobbied for specific legislation to make these therapies universally available. And they were the first activist group that read the right to health that was enshrined in the new democratic constitution of 1988 as equaling right to access to medicines. And they were very successful in that process. In marrying medical and economic concerns, this AIDS mobilization acquired transformative power indeed. The Brazilian government was able to reduce the treatment costs by reverse drug engineering and promoting the production of generics in both public and private sector laboratories. Had an infrastructure for the production of generics not been in place, the story being told today would probably be very different. And again, activist scientists, they were within state labs, and they decided to transfer the know-how that they had acquired in the industry into state labs, and they created this system of drug reverse engineering so that the state could then face the industry and struggle over drug price differentiations with this know-how that was locally engineering. And media campaigns generated strong national and international support. The fact is, however, that Brazil is experiencing today what other countries treating AIDS will soon face. Cheap first-line ARVs are available, but a growing number of patients need newer drugs that are entering the market. As a result, Brazil's ARV budget has recently doubled. In spite of the country's generic production, some 80% of the medication in the budget is patented. One of the unintended consequences of AIDS treatment rollout, and I showed this throughout this work, has been the consolidation of a model of public health centered on pharmaceutical distribution. And activist policymakers have to adopt ever new political strategies to confront predatory corporate practices to keep the rollout in place. Amidst a striking decrease in AIDS mortality, this is what I call pharmaceuticalization of public health, also promotes models of treatment inclusion that redefine some segments of the population as disposable. And here I will conclude with some thoughts on what's actually happening on the ground. On the ground, health programs do not work in tandem, and administrative discontinuities abound. Different provinces allocate resources differently according to the pressure of interest groups, and the AIDS NGOs that were supposed to have taken over assistances have long lost idealism and passion. As activist Gerson Winkler bitterly told me, they keep selecting their clientele and find all kinds of ways to pretend that they are fulfilling their project's goals. End of quote. Thus, against the background of budgetary constraints, regional politics, and the industrialization of non-governmental sector, a multitude of interpersonal networks and variations in AIDS care have emerged, creating uneven levels of quality of life for patients. AIDS survivors live in a state of flux, simultaneously acknowledging and disguising their condition to avoid stigma while they struggle to survive. The political grounds of existence here have been increasingly individualized, and poor AIDS patients rarely become activists themselves. As Louise, who has been on IRVs for 10 years now, put it, medication is the good part of the state. The rest is for me to do. Medication is me now. Navigating through complex treatment regimes, they work hard to find jobs and remain eligible to bus vouchers, food baskets at NGOs and churches, and additional medicines at local health posts. They live between moments, between spaces, scavenging for resources, and only a few manage to constitute themselves as patient citizens. In the words of Evangelvaldo, it is the financial part of life that tortures me. At both the macro and micro levels, we see a state of technical fix and triage and a politics of survival crystallizing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'll just be fairly brief in introducing a little bit of my background and exposure to AIDS. If João's entry into the subject of AIDS is shaped by his experiences with Brazil, which mostly has been a very positive model of what is possible in dealing with this epidemic, my experiences and interest were piqued by my views in South Africa, which was kind of the flip side, the kind of tragic case of how this epidemic can spread, kill, and not be addressed in the ways it could. And actually, my interest got piqued just initially as an undergraduate here at Princeton in the Woodrow Wilson School program in 1991, when I was a member of a policy task force, and only at Princeton would, and maybe only at the Woodrow Wilson School, would they send a bunch of us as juniors off to South Africa in 1991 to do field research. And I tell people that now, and they look at me, what an opportunity. And we really weren't focused on AIDS. We were focused on the post-apartheid transition, how exciting it was that Nelson Mandela had been released from prison and all this political activity was going on. But I still remember distinctly walking through the township of Alexandria, and we knew that AIDS was becoming a real problem. It was already over a 1% prevalence rate. But, we stopped at a traditional healer in the township of Alexandria who said, oh, yeah, AIDS is no problem. I have right here a cure for AIDS on my shelf. And, we kind of smiled and thought that was amusing. Little did we kind of really know how resistance to Western ideas of germ theories of disease and the resistance to ideas about how HIV was being transmitted would become a really big problem. And so it was kind of in the back of my mind, but our work in South Africa at that time really had almost nothing to do with AIDS. And like much of the country, people were focused on politics and democracy and the end of apartheid. But I returned to South Africa, again, having nothing to do with AIDS, to do my doctoral research in 1997, 98. And what happened then was I came home and someone I knew well who was interested in AIDS, as I was saying about all these wonderful things that were happening with the consolidation of democracy in South Africa, she said to me, but what about this crazy AIDS program? Why on earth is that government not providing this cheap prophylaxis for pregnant mothers that has been proven in Thailand to dramatically reduce the passage of HIV from mothers to children? And I said, good question. I have no idea. But then I started reading the newspaper. And as Chris mentioned, I was doing work on taxation. It's not what I was thinking about. But then started reading the newspapers and thinking, my God, I was so excited about this place. My passion for politics and why I went into graduate work was because of the energy that was going on in South Africa, and here's this disease that is going to bring this society and government down. And I realized that was what I wanted to do research on, and I went to Yale and I worked with Mike Merson at Yale, who was there at the time, who had been the first head of the global program on AIDS, and I was proposing a kind of next project to understand why would countries around the world, in the face of this single epidemic, which we're living in an era where information is transmitted so widely, and we kind of know how to prevent the spread of HIV. Why would governments respond in such different ways? And South Africa was showing a kind of negative case, and Brazil was showing a positive case. And at the time, since I was just working on developing countries, I was completely committed to only working on prevention. Brazil was an exception, but for the most part, I, like everyone else in 2001, was thinking, well, treatment, that's something for just the rich countries. This is not going to be on the agenda. And it was quite amazing. It's caused me to do a lot of extra work, but to realize midway through the project, treatment is going to become the name of the game. And because of activists in Brazil and elsewhere who made treatment a truly viable reality for countries around the world, that's something that's become of great interest to me. And here at Princeton, thanks to Chris and to Anne-Marie's sponsorship from their respective institutional posts, we've been able to host, João and I have been hosting a colloquium series on some of the impacts of treatment. And it's really in some ways, AIDS treatment sounds like this technical medical issue, but it is a profound social transformation about citizenship, about global governance, and about changing people's lives and societies. And so we really need to think about this issue in those terms, at least I'm trying to. And so that's kind of the context of where I'll be coming from in my remarks.
Hi. It's nice to be here. My first time in Princeton. It's very nice, pretty. Let's see. First of all, I'm the director of something called the Collaborative Fund for HIV Treatment Preparedness. The Collaborative Fund is a community-driven funding mechanism that is primarily led by people living with HIV all over the world. And it's a funding mechanism that really is built upon empowerment theory to spur community mobilization for increased HIV treatment access and treatment literacy so that people understand and can make and follow through on treatment decisions. And we are working in, well, right now we're funding in over 70 countries around the world, and over the last 2 or 3 years have funded over 500 projects. From the emergence, well, I've been doing AIDS work since, I guess, about 1985, and since people talked about what brought them into AIDS. I'm a gay man in New York City. If you were a gay man in New York City in 1985, you were drawn into AIDS whether you liked it or not. And I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it sort of became my life. And I'm lucky to be here. The emergence of the HIV pandemic, I think that community mobilization has been in the forefront of the response to AIDS from the very beginning. It was the communities affected by HIV that responded before anybody else responded, starting with the formation of Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York in 1981, the world's first AIDS organization. And we see several stages of mobilization to respond to the epidemic. The very first one was really to just develop very basic support mechanisms for people who all of a sudden found themselves on their deathbeds at rather young ages and nobody knew why. So the very first mobilization was, how do we visit people in the hospital? How do we get some level of information out? How do we begin to care for people at just very, very basic levels? And the second level of mobilization was really around education and the development of the models for safer sex practices and then promoting those models in the communities. All of those, the prevention approaches to HIV were all developed by people living with AIDS and communities affected by AIDS, and frankly didn't come out of the public health community. And then the next level of advocacy came with demands for treatment and really looking at the research and drug development process to ensure a faster drug development models. And I'll make a somewhat controversial and somewhat exaggerated statement and say that other than the scientific advances, the discovery of the virus, drug discovery, all of the major advances and successes in HIV response since 1981 have been developed by people with AIDS. It's a bit of an exaggeration, and I don't want to take away from the really important work that government officials and industry and particularly healthcare workers have done, but really everything that's worked has come from people with AIDS. And I'm happy to talk more about that. And treatment activism in particular has shown remarkable results. It has transformed the clinical research practice in the United States. It's transformed drug development and drug approval processes here. The drugs that I take were developed and approved faster than any drugs in the history of the U.S. drug development. We've had enormous impact on drug pricing, and the global initiatives that for treatment that we now see put into place, the Global Fund on AIDS Treatment and Malaria, the President's PEPFAR program, none of those, frankly, would have existed without the work of AIDS treatment activists pushing in the forefront. And it has led to really what is the most ambitious public health undertaking in history. Getting ARVs out to the developed world is an incredibly complex, difficult, lifelong task, and it's a great experiment. We have no idea if it's going to work. We could be making the situation much worse. I think empowerment theory is particularly valuable in addressing HIV for a whole bunch of reasons. One, in order to respond to HIV, we need to have the long-term engagement of people who are infected and affected. Right? People who are living with AIDS are the partners in all of the success regarding prevention and treatment. Treatment is a lifelong process. If you're not very strictly adherent to your treatment, treatment fails. You want prevention to be successful, then people who are infected have to be partners in prevention programs. So the empowerment of those of us who are infected is really an essential component to the success of any public health intervention, unless you're going to shoot us or put us in a camp. The individual empowerment of people with AIDS is really essential if you're going to, in order to be able to overcome the stigma and discrimination associated both with HIV itself and then with many of the behaviors that are associated with HIV. The nature of transmission really goes to the heart of our most personal behaviors. And so in order to be able to address the threat of HIV in our lives, we have to really confront what our sexual behaviors are and be able to talk more openly about them. And it requires overcoming the sexual and gender inequity that most people around the world face if they want to either stay uninfected or address their HIV infection and protect others. Okay?
Thanks a lot. So what I'm going to do is I have some questions, and these are not sprung on these guys. We've talked about them, so don't. But I thought it would be good to break it up and sort of go through topic by topic, and you all may have questions and topics that you want to discuss as well. One of the first things that always comes up, and I think in every kind of symposium on AIDS that I've been to, the question of HIV/AIDS exceptionalism comes up. And part of the issue is, are we really talking about something that's very special and very different and has no that we can't learn anything from about other areas of health or other epidemics in the world? So I guess the question that I first have for the panelists is, is it the case that HIV/AIDS activism is somehow exceptional? And how has the role of activism in ARV access been different from the role in access to treatments for malaria or prevention of malaria or TB or other major health problems around the world? And more generally, does one sort of lead to the other? David, you mentioned something about malaria, which is, is the infrastructure that we're developing for HIV going to help with a broader set of health questions, health problems? So I don't know, Den, do you want to start, or we can do this in any order?
Sure. Is this? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did talk about this in advance, and it's something I think about a lot as well. And I basically come down by answering it is exceptional in some ways and it's not in others. Maybe that's a cop-out answer, but I think it's really true. I mean, in some ways, when you look at the history of AIDS treatment activism in this country, and I believe in many other countries, it does follow from these social movements that have been in place more historically in countries or cities or communities that have responded to other issues around communities and their relationship to government and power structures and public health, et cetera. So it does follow a trajectory, and some of the tactics that have been used are not, were tactics that were used in civil rights movement, et cetera. But there are some unique things and some exceptional aspects. But I think, and I'll talk about what I think some of those are in a minute, but I think those exceptional aspects have now come full circle and are helping to feed social movements and activism in other areas in a good way. So by some of the exceptional things about HIV, and not in any particular order, one is just the nature of disease itself. I mean, we're talking, most diseases that affect communities and population level effects that we're seeing in developing countries in particular, although I will point out that the most recent data on the U.S. epidemic, a national survey, found that among blacks in America, prevalence was 2%. That would be considered a generalized epidemic anywhere else in the world. So we have places in our country and communities in our country that are experiencing the epidemic in very different ways. But globally, the impacts we've seen in countries have really altered age structures and reduce life expectancy. Why is that? Well, most diseases that affect populations affect the very young children, under 5, or the very old, not with HIV. What's unique about HIV is that it's primarily affecting young people who are working or will be working, who are contributing in various ways, economically, reproductively, etc., in societies. That is a phenomenon that had not really occurred in this way before. To have a phenomenon that really reversed life expectancy gains in whole countries that had been gaining for a century is a remarkable thing. And that, I think, really sets it apart. So that's one exception. And that, again, I think the way the activism around that has lent itself to other things, but it's still an exception, and it still remains an exception. Secondly, and David touched on this, the very behaviors that put people at risk are behaviors themselves that are culturally stigmatized, mean different things in different cultures, and raise a whole host of challenges to every society and every community. And that's not the same as SARS. That's not the same as malaria. So there are some unique things, again, about HIV. And then the third sort of unique aspect to it, from my perspective, is that the way that the social movement has grown up around AIDS treatment activism has been about identity. Identity of people with HIV and people affected by HIV as the movement, as the response, a health identity, in a sense, a disease identity that's been co-opted back in a good way, that hadn't really had that kind of history before, where literally the body of people infected became the mechanism by which activism was demonstrated, literally. That, to me, is also unique. And then one other aspect, the fact, in this country in particular, but I think this is played out in other countries, the fact that one of the first communities most affected was the gay community, or most affected that was able to launch a response, a coordinated response, was the gay community, meant that part of that response, and this set it apart from prior social movements, involved very creative uses of art, of media, of visuals that hadn't really, in very new ways, that has actually, frankly, become a big part of the way activism happens for many movements now. I don't think that really existed in the same way as it did because of AIDS activism. So ultimately, I think it is exceptional, but many of the things that have grown out of AIDS activism are now translating into, and I'd be curious to see what David would say, but into movements of other kinds of rights-based movements in other countries. By empowering people to be treatment activists, it's led to other unintended benefits, I guess.
Thank you. Does somebody else want to?
I would agree with everything that Jennifer has said, and there's a lot of ways in which we can think about the exceptionalism of AIDS. But I was struck, I went and looked at a book by Margaret Keck and Catherine Sekink about transnational activists, and it had nothing to do with AIDS. It was written, I think, in the late 1990s, and they talked about a boomerang model of transnational activism. Now, I'm thinking about AIDS as a global movement and global AIDS treatment, not in the United States, but the very important global implications. And the idea of the boomerang model was that you could imagine I've never thrown a boomerang, so I'll describe this without any first-hand experience. But I think what happens, I've seen it, you throw, right, and that's kind of local activists saying, hey, we have AIDS, or we're concerned about AIDS, and they go to the state to try to get policy change. But then the way a boomerang kind of stops at some point in midair, the state kind of blocks access to change policies. In other words, there's no effect. And Brazil, I think, is exceptional in that regard, in which there was an effect. But for most countries, either it was a very weak throw or the state blocked it. But then it kind of comes back around, gathers momentum with other transnational networks of AIDS activists, which then come around and gather more momentum with international organizations, whether it's the UN, rich country governments, and a lot of power and force swirl around, including resources, and then kind of clunk those governments back in the head, where you had first thrown it at. And that makes an impact. And the point is that model, I think, really applies to AIDS and was developed for the environment, for a bunch of other types of issues. So in that way, I think AIDS activism is not unique. But because of some of the exceptional features, the passions involved having to do with blood, sex, drugs, have made it particularly powerful. The scope of a contagious disease, which people can kind of in their heads begin to think, boy, if we don't deal with this on a global scale, we're really talking about global destruction, I think heightens the intensity. And the one other thing I'd say is that AIDS is different from certain other diseases because these other diseases don't have the same compelling narratives, but AIDS is kind of sweeping them up in their wake. We know that co-infection with malaria and TB lead to much worse consequences in terms of increased susceptibility to the virus and quicker onset of symptoms and death. And as a result, we see the global fund is not just for AIDS, but also for TB and malaria. So these other diseases are getting attention because of AIDS, and even in the U.S., first there was PEPFAR, which was for AIDS treatment, and now we're beginning to see money rolled out for malaria as well. So in that way, AIDS is exceptional, but it's bringing along these other diseases for more attention to global health.
Okay, just a very quick remark. I want to bring the market into the picture. A lot of the success of the Brazilian AIDS policy has to do with the encroachment of activism within the state. That's very important. So it was not just transnational networks. Activists had to become part of policymaking. They created an island of excellence, and they somehow ended up doing efficient work for a government that was a loss in terms of social policies. So they really seized the moment and they occupied it well. So they also were able to couch their practices in a language of human rights and the right to life and a culture of care and solidarity. But also, if one looks in retrospect now, the success of the Brazilian AIDS policy is also a market success. Before Brazil signed the treatment law in '96, there were basically no markets for ARVs outside of the Western world. So something very interesting happened. Why was the policy signed in November '96? That same year, Brazil had signed in TRIPS, Intellectual Property Rights Agreement. The following year, the increase of imports was fantastic, from $400 million to $1.3 billion. And so in some ways, the state also was molding itself to a global economy, was changing trade rules, wanted investments to come in, and with Brazil signing the treatment law, it became a captive market for the pharmaceutical industry as well. So I'm just trying to say there are many thresholds are crossed, opportunities are seized, and new landscapes emerge. So it's not like a causal narrative, but it's a narrative of movement. And regard of the exceptionalism, so AIDS activism in Brazil really set the tone and became a template of what patient activism these days is. Modeled after AIDS activists, now all kinds of patient groups mobilized and demand access to medicines from the state. So that's what I mean by the pharmaceuticalization of public health, where now, with the demise of public health care infrastructures, no intervention necessarily on prevention in a massive scale. So what we see is that patients are claiming their right to citizenship in terms of access to medicines. And we see now the pharmaceutical industry lobbying patient groups to pressure the state, to force the state through juridical claims to afford them very expensive medicines, like for experimental therapies for genetic diseases and so on and so forth. So we see at local level, with the decentralization of the state, we see like huge problems with public health budgets. So in some ways, a successful policy at a central national level, at a technological level, but if you look at the local level, new kinds of questions about human rights and equity emerge.
Thanks. You know what, you said one thing that I hope David talks about the original question, but the other thing that I was really intrigued with is this idea of the pharmaceutical companies coming back and starting to lobby the activist groups, to lobby the government to buy. And I don't know how that's played out in the U.S., whether you've seen anything similar.
Not quite. But
there was a convergence of agendas in the 80s and 90s, where, so treatment activists, we like to take credit for everything, but there was this convergence of agendas. So the Bush administration, Dan Quayle in particular, was really a force behind a more rapid drug approval system, and and certainly industry had no qualms with our pushing for faster drug approval. So there were places where there were common agendas, and I also think that both within the research establishment, within academia, within government, and within industry, the initial response to treatment activists coming forward and saying, we need to be a part of this research process. Right? And that was a really important component of our initial demands, that it isn't just do something for us, but you need us in the midst of your clinical research process. We need to be involved in designing the studies. If we're going to be able to participate in these studies, then they have to be designed with our needs in mind. And therefore, having us at the table as you do that is going to be valuable. And the initial response to that was no way. And you don't know enough. You're going to release confidential information, and you're just going to get in the way, and we're the experts. And after there were few key people who really opened a door, and once we got in that door and actually got to the table, there was a real transformation in people's thinking. I think that getting patients involved in the development of clinical research is actually very, very valuable, and has been incorporated into the NIH system well beyond HIV.
So did you have anything else to say on the exceptionalism?
Very quickly, because I think people have said a lot, but one, there's no cure. This isn't TB, so it is exceptional in that regard. So your public health practice that you would use for TB really doesn't work that well in HIV. And like when somebody with a TB background comes in and says, "Well, let's just do it the way we did it for TB," it takes me a year to re-educate them. And I guess on a good day when I'm feeling slightly optimistic, I like to think that AIDS is exceptional in that sometimes things happen that serve as catalysts for change, and maybe AIDS is a catalyst for change, and AIDS is exceptional in that it will transform the way we look at health delivery around the world and the right to health.
So I want to save time for other questions, but there's two things that I really want to get. So I'm going to put two questions together, and people can decide what they want to focus on. And I think this is something that's really important is, why is it that in some countries activism seems to have been very successful at getting motion, and in other countries it really has had a hard time taking root? And related to that is, how is international activism playing into helping countries that are having a hard time having activism take root? The other thing that I'm very interested in is how social movements concerned with HIV/AIDS have changed over time. And João, you said the two things that in some sense are almost, maybe they go together, but you said them at different points. And one is that you said something about NGOs having long since lost their passion. And then the other thing you said was that activists have to become policymakers. And I wonder whether those two things aren't related, and how we've had sort of a renewal process for activism, or whether it's sort of losing your passion is a necessary part. So I don't. Do you want to take the same order or whatever?
Can I just mention that? I interviewed over time, several of the key players, in the designing and implementation of the Brazilian AIDS policy, including former president, the Minister of Health, and also Paulo Teixeira, who was one of the coordinators of the program and went to the WHO to work on the 3x5, program as well. And it's very. On the last time I interviewed him, it was very interesting. He was very aware, that activism became professionalized in the process, So there was a professionalization of activism, and it perfected itself internationally, So it was very fundamental for these activists to have the networks to perfect themselves internationally, to acquire skills. And, but it also did not escape to him that the activists also ended up enhancing the administrative capacity of the state. You know, a state that was increasingly decentralized, you know, was trying to minimize its interventions in the social field. So it needed to have like strong know-how as well. And in some ways, you know, what happened in the process, you had this excellent group of activists, wonderful, progressive, you know, making all the things necessary to ensure the access to the ARVs. But at the local level, you didn't see NGOs picking up the new problems emerging as people now were resuming lives considered normal. You know, they needed jobs, they were having children, they wanted partnerships. So somehow, that's where the NGO, the industrialization of the local NGOs, which were supposed to somehow have been outsourced to care, they did not pick up these new realities that emerged with the large-scale distribution of medicine. I think that's the point I was trying to make. And in some ways, you know, also, like, but there are many levels and layers of activism. At a national level, we see now Brazilian NGOs really trying to establish partnerships with other countries. So they created this kind of like, it's called Laços Sul-Sul, South ties, which is cooperation over access to ARVs, making them available to Nicaragua, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau. And another network of technology transfer, Brazil, China, Nigeria, Russia, really Ukraine is good with testings, really trying to find cheaper technologies. And relationship with Cuba as well, trying to develop some therapies, you know, to have in mind that these large-scale rollouts will not sustain themselves, given the patent regimes, if alternatives are not made to make the second or third line treatments also cheaper and available to people once they acquire drug resistance. So you see at the national level these international networks that are very fundamental to set the tone of the agenda, maybe create bargaining power, you know, for governance, et cetera, But at the local level, you know, the NGOs do not seem to be keeping pace with the incredible demands of the poorest who are the most afflicted by the epidemic.
Dan, did you want to say anything on that?
Maybe we should like David. Yes,
sure. Well, why has it taken root in different places and not others? First of all, I think that there's a lot more activism going on in the world than people may know about. The last 3 years, I'm spending my time with treatment activists in China who are incredibly sophisticated and who are drug users, who are people who come from very small villages in rural areas, with transgendered people in India who are really fierce treatment educators who can teach everybody what an antiviral is, the life cycle of the virus, what the drugs are, what the side effects are, with drug users in Russia who, in Russia, the AIDS activism in Russia is, they're all kids. I'm in a college, but, because they were all infected when they were 16 and 17 years old because they were all shooting heroin together and they all got infected together, and now they're 19, 20, and 22 years old, and they're finding out that they have HIV, and they're turning into AIDS activists, and they know an awful lot about AIDS treatment, and they know an awful lot about their government. So I think activism is incredibly widespread, but it's very different place to place for a lot of clear reasons. Poverty, the multiple crises that people face in their lives, communications access is a huge issue, and sort of, I guess, the history of civil society in a particular country. Why did it, it took a lot longer to get things going in Russia than it did in South Africa. And you have a movement in South Africa that goes well before AIDS. In Russia, there's very little history of any civil society, anything. So there's a lot of different factors. But this notion of people with HIV becoming empowered and responding to their situation by coming together, forming organizations, and doing some sort of care provision or advocacy is universal. We see it happen everywhere, in every country, every place. Right? Tasso in Uganda was, 1989? You know, we're looking at these models just growing everywhere, sort of evolving and just spontaneously on their own. And I really think it comes from this notion of personal empowerment and community empowerment that is particular. If there's anything that's exceptional to AIDS, it's the role of empowerment in addressing the disease.
So what about how activism has changed?
How has activism changed over time? Well, we did a really bad job of training people and bringing new people up in the U.S. So the state of activism in the U.S. around domestic issues is dismal. And yes, absolutely. I think everything you've said is absolutely right. And the professionalism is essential, but it is also then, AIDS is a big industry now, and there are NGOs all over the world that are in existence to keep their funding streams moving. Yeah, but the passion is very much there, you know, I think, and it really is. You've got to go find it, you know, and see who's really doing that.
Yeah, I think, there's no doubt that activists on a global scale have been incredibly important for ultimately delivering drug treatment on a global scale. But when we look country by country, I don't think we can make the link that where there's been more treatment, that's because there's been more local activism. When we look at and again, Brazil would fit that model. There was a lot of activism and there's a lot of treatment, but it's actually exceptional in the pattern in some ways. If we look at a country like Botswana, which has a huge AIDS epidemic, and there's an incredible treatment program, that really wasn't because of local level activism. And then we look at a country like South Africa with this rich civil society, with the probably most vibrant social movement in the treatment action campaign that we have in the world, and Zaki Ahmad, who's world-renowned. Well, in fact, South Africa hasn't been particularly successful, that organization, the social movements that it's brought along, have still faced a very reluctant state. Similarly, in India, there's been activism. There's a very vibrant civil society, and the Indian state's been quite slow in responding. And when I've looked across countries in terms of levels of treatment coverage, the percentage of people who are receiving treatment as a share of those who need it, there's a wide variety of, it's amazing the scope of countries, whether they're democracies or non-democracies. There are countries that are doing well and poorly in these categories. Cuba has been incredibly aggressive on AIDS. They've been so aggressive they don't have that many people who are infected, but everyone who's infected is getting treatment, and that doesn't stick in our head of thinking that all good things kind of happen in democracies, whereas a country like South Africa has not done well. And part of it is, I think, the passions of AIDS, which have driven forward movements in terms of activism, have also resulted in a lot of counter movements in the politics of AIDS, which in democratic settings, we just have to remember that political leaders tend to do things in order to stay in office. And for much of the AIDS epidemic through today, though I think it's getting better, AIDS is such a stigmatized problem that in many democracies, government leaders haven't acted because they didn't want to bring attention to this problem. So getting to Chris's question about preconditions of success, I don't think there are no strict preconditions, but related to I don't know if anyone was at the panel this morning or is familiar with Paul Slovik's work, who's going to speak later today, in talking about the roles of networks and social identities, and also the construction of risk. And one of the things about AIDS is it is this objective danger, but not everywhere has it been immediately understood as this profound risk. I remember visiting an area in South Africa where there was 40% HIV infection rate, but people weren't talking about AIDS. People didn't. They just didn't want to talk about it or experience it, and didn't want to say that this is something that might affect them, when of course it was affecting everybody. So one of the things that I found in my research, Chris pointed out, that the title of my book is Boundaries of Contagion, because I think social boundaries have played a huge role, that in countries where there are, for example, very strongly constructed ethnic identities that are highly divisive, that has proven a barrier to societies thinking about AIDS as a generalized risk. And governments have responded by not being as aggressive, whereas in societies, in countries where boundaries are very fluid and flexible, and again, talking more the way Bob Putnam was discussing this morning, when people are shifting identities and association in vast webs and networks, and they can imagine, boy, if someone else in this country is infected with HIV, eventually that's going to affect me and my family or my extended group of friends. Well, then it's easier to then go to the government and say, hey, this is something that we need to do something about. So those are some of the issues that I think matter.
I'll just add a couple things, because maybe we want to move to any questions soon. On this issue of, in the way you were framing it just now, what's the preconditions to success of treatment activism? I had to actually separate out. I think one element in increase in the share of a population having access to antiretrovirals is the effectiveness of treatment activism, but I don't think that's the only thing. I think we can look at treatment activism on its own and look at a place like Russia, which has pretty poor access, and say that there's successful treatment activism there because people are becoming empowered. And something else I'm going to get to in a minute about an idea of survival, that is a success. But because of the lack of a civil society history in Russia, because of the Russian government and unique things about it, the government itself is I don't think we would expect to see a direct correlation all the time between successful treatment activism and increased share in antiretrovirals. So I wouldn't want to use that as the measure. And we have the biggest donor in the world is the United States in terms of where it's choosing to put funding for treatment. So there's a lot of complex factors, and I just want to keep them a little bit separate, although clearly they're related. But I think one aspect of a precondition on treatment activism is it is empowerment. It's a concept of survival. When an individual, and usually it's not in isolation, it's with others, have a sense of survival and why survival is important. And that becomes a notion that's a driving force, that some people deserve to survive. And I think that is maybe it's not a precondition, but it's a common part of the movements that have formed. It's about, I deserve to survive, and that means I'm going to demand from government, international NGOs, others, the right to survive. And in places like Brazil, where health is already considered a human right, that was part of the thinking in a country like Brazil already, that argument wasn't as difficult as an argument. You could say, well, what about South Africa, where the new South Africa, that is also a way that it's, South Africa has other reasons why the government hasn't responded that have to do with stigma, that have to do with emerging out of arguably one of the most horrible oppressions in our world's history, to then be faced with yet another thing that could slap the country down. So it's very complex, but I think survival and understanding the importance of survival and that survival is deserved is a critical element. In terms of movements changing over time, I think that the AIDS activist movement in the United States and elsewhere have followed a somewhat predictable path that other social movements follow, which is they become more co-opted, they become more part of the system. In good ways and bad ways. In good ways, their clinical research in our country is now done with patients for many things. That's a good thing. In other ways, pharmaceutical companies are funding activism. Sometimes there's a convergence, sometimes there's not. So it's a complex scenario. But what is unique again with HIV and a challenge too is part of the loss of translation of activist lessons is that people have died. So the loss has been literally attrition due to death, and that's a unique factor. And then the other thing that I think about a lot is that the movement was very successful in the beginning in the way it used its passion and sense of deserving to survive to channel that into activism. The movement became successful. It changed institutions. It became part of institutions. And today, I don't think there's a good precedent for how it goes next. What is the next phase of activism? And one of the things that I spent a lot of time on in my job is why we haven't been able to mobilize a successful movement around prevention activism. I have a lot of reasons that I think that we haven't been able to do it, but ultimately, because we haven't and because it doesn't look like we're really getting there quickly enough, we're going to lose the battle. So that's just another big challenge.
Thank you. Now, some of you may have said things that are so controversial that other people want to respond, but I think we should probably take some questions from the audience, too. Yes. And you should probably say, I mean, it could be a general question, or if you want to direct it to one person, that's great. Okay.
I want to say two things, so I'm not going to give up the mic for two things, okay? One of them I think will be easy to understand. Aussi, João, I understand that in Brazil, it has also, AIDS has not been demonized. It has not been called a sin, okay? It has not been counted as a sin. The Catholic Church hasn't gotten in the way of trying to find a solution for AIDS, and I think that is one of the reasons, at least from what I've read and what I understand, that it has been able to conquer so much in Brazil, right? That's pretty true. Okay. Thank you. And você pode dizer o que quiser afterwards. The thing that I wonder here, I'm on the board of an AIDS ministry in Houston. And on the board of an AIDS ministry in Houston it's Windsor Village United Methodist Church. It's an African-American mega church in Houston. And this is huge. It's really, really huge. They have it there in their church because they don't feel taken care of or even acknowledged by the greater AIDS community and the Houston AIDS and all the stuff that is dealing with AIDS. And my question would be, why is there no African American here on the panel? Right now, for upper middle class and middle class African Americans in the United States, new HIV/AIDS cases are at epidemic proportions. The CDC has put out videos on all of this explaining the whole phenomenon of the down low. I don't know if you all know about it, but some of you might. How is it that today, something as huge as this, and we do not have an African American here on a panel dealing with access to antiretrovirals for HIV and even communication among one of our major communities in the United States? So that was my two things.
It might be really useful for David to talk about how, because the demographics of AIDS has changed, and so the activism has to change, and it might be useful to hear how that's playing out.
Okay, well, first of all, I had nothing to do with putting the panel together.
No, this is me, but I'll take responsibility.
So I can't answer that question. Well, I don't know. Jen, you've also, I think you've spent a lot more time on this set of questions over the last few years than I have. But, so I'll turn it to you. But, in terms of activism in the U.S. treatment changed activism in the U.S. a great deal. And it allowed particularly more middle-class white gay men who had access to treatment first to become complacent. It's like, okay, well, my initial threat has been addressed, so I'm going to go on with my life. And there's something to be said about going on with your life. And AIDS increasingly has become a disease of color and a disease of poverty in the U.S.
Well, I wasn't talking about poverty.
I know, but yeah. And then you've got to, well, I don't know. I'll let you.
Most of the work that I do on U.S. policy on HIV has to do with the impact on Black America because the impact is so striking. And I agree with you. Most people don't know that. It's hard to talk about. And the galvanizing and the movement has to come, and it already is coming from empowered Black activists who are leading the movement. And a friend of ours, Phil Wilson, and several other people are doing just that, working with institutions, working with the church. We do a lot of work for example, with BET, trying to work with organizations that reach the Black community. But one of the things I always say with HIV that's such a struggle, besides all of the issues we all talked about around stigma and all that, is that when we're always too late. And so if we can say today, which we can, that 50% of new AIDS cases are among African Americans in this country, that's the result of something that started 10 years ago, 12 years ago, at a time when nobody really wanted to embrace the fact that the epidemic was shifting. And so what always happens with HIV is once we get to that aha moment and we can convince whoever it is that we need to convince, somebody affected, a government, that this community has been affected, it's almost too late. I don't really mean it's too late, because I wouldn't be doing this work for 20 years if I did think that, but it's almost too late to get ahead of it. And that's one of the reasons why prevention is so hard. You almost need to get to that point before you can get a big response. And in the case of the impact on African Americans in our country, that's connected to a whole history of neglect. So it's
and how would you see the potential role of African American political leaders, and why have they been so slow in addressing it?
The black leadership in the United States fought against needle exchange for the first 10, 15 years of the epidemic. Did not acknowledge the high rates of HIV within the black church, because it meant acknowledging an awful lot of gay sex within the black church. It's been incredibly slow to respond. I would say, frankly, I would say the same thing about leadership within the women's movement in the United States, that was still has not responded to the threat that HIV is for women.
Just to add one thing on black leadership in response to this epidemic, because it's starting. Actually, there was a very historic meeting a month or so ago of many of the leading black organizations in the United States, who all, NAACP, all Urban League, they all came out with statements saying we have to do more. I mean, that was a very important moment. And I actually will make an analogy to why I always see the South African government being slow to act, which is when you are encountering and facing so many obstacles in rising to power, acknowledging yet another that is so hard to really battle, can be seen as a liability, even if we can all sit here and see it as the opposite. If you don't take this on, that's the liability. So you put stigma, you put homophobia, you put all of those things together with the struggles that black leaders have had in this country to get representation, to be to gain in political movements, mainstream political movements, and they've seen it as a liability.
And it's not just because they're overwhelmed. It's because saying we've got a big AIDS problem means saying, hey, members of our community are having sex out of wedlock, they're sharing drugs, they're doing these immoral behaviors, and so I think
that the community had been accused of, 30 years ago, and feeds on all kinds of misconceptions.
And if I just respond to two things, I mean, there's a great ABC special called Out of Control, where there's all these interviews with black political leaders, and you can see Jesse Jackson does not want to respond to this question, why haven't you done more on AIDS, or this black political leader. So one reason why there isn't someone on this panel is there has been a lack of black leadership in the issue. But the other thing I wanted to point out is I would like to believe going forward that and what struck me as being so successful in Brazil is that that's not the way in which people conceived of how they would deal with AIDS. Oh, well, there's blacks in Brazil. There should be a black leader who deals with black AIDS in Brazil. We need to think about this as a politics of empathy where groups don't have to care for them. What's exciting about AIDS is that we're talking about kind of global citizenship in a sense of, hey, we're actually all in this together. So it shouldn't be little tribes or groups have to be the ones to speak for themselves. I think we ought to take it as a collective responsibility. One quick clarification having to do with ginseng. We need to remember that the thing about HIV is that it can take 7 to 10 years before people are symptomatic after being infected, and that's part of the reason why we're so behind. Is we don't know that the infection has exploded until people are symptomatic, which is way too late.
I totally agree. Just if you look at year one of the data from the CDC and the demographic breakdown, even then, the number of cases among African Americans was disproportionate to their representation in the population. So yes, a big part of it is the lag, but it's also a different kind of lag.
I just want to respond briefly to what Evan said, and I will go to your question. I have been working with social epidemiologists in Bahia as well, and we found we found incredible results when we analyzed death certificates of patients who died with AIDS in AIDS units of the state, and this is the AIDS unit where the poorest go, and the poorest, are mulattoes, African, Brazilians, and we have consistently found that the level of registration of poor AIDS patients who come basically to die in the clinic, it's about 26%. So basically, 3/4 of the population remains unaccounted for. And we went to the ministry, to the wonderful activists and health professionals, and they always say, we need to do more studies about this. And now finally, in the state of São Paulo, they're showing that the survival rate, of African Brazilians of African descent is much lower. The access to treatment is just, there's a huge gap if compared to with white patients, middle class patients, according to regions as well. So race and class are a huge thing, and there's a lot of diversity in social mobilization, but it cuts across, the fault lines of class and race, and I think that's one of the hugest challenges, because on the ground we don't see a politicization of this condition via non-governmental organizations. That I found very, very, very troubling and very difficult. And at the national level, you need to sustain the rollout, and it's very complicated to sustain such an expensive rollout that addresses 200,000 citizens of a population of 185 million. Just to make that, a socially possible thing, and with like millions of dollars involved, it's a huge task. So there's this dissonance at work. Regarding the aspect of religion, there were comments like that, but Brazil has this strong tradition among the Catholic Church, also of liberation theology, very progressive, priests and nuns. So even though there were the more conservative voices, there was also like a sense of a solidarity with the poor and working at a grassroots level, and definitely, so the discourse of care and solidarity was much stronger, and it really got entrenched nationally.
We have time for, I think we've had one question, and we probably have time for one more. So those were good answers and a really good question. Yeah, please.
I have a question about tactics. When I think about the AIDS activist movement in this country, the first thing that pops in my mind, and this may betray a whole lot of biases, is really cool street protests.
Is what?
Really cool street protests. I mean, there was some good stuff, and I think Jennifer Cates made the point that some of that sort of thing has been adopted by other movements, but it's not the sort of tactic you would think about if you're thinking of a strategy of affecting FDA regulatory approvals. There's a sort of logical disconnect between the two, and I'm wondering what you see and obviously, a lot of the work that you do now is very different from that sort of thing. But I'm wondering what you see as the connection between those things and the policy world, and how much they played or didn't play a role in driving this issue. And if I can get you to think beyond HIV for a second, how that compares to, say, protests and civil rights movement, protests and peace movement. If I'm really pushing the envelope of the subject.
We're going to need fairly quick responses.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Two quick responses. First of all, and I planned that FDA demo. That we wrote them a letter, right? We said we said we'd like to have a discussion with you, and they didn't respond to us. So eventually we said, well, we've just got to go there and take over the building. And nobody had ever done a demonstration at the Food and Drug Administration headquarters. There was actually a great deal of debate about that demonstration and where to hold it. And there were a lot of people who were saying, we really should go to the Capitol. We really should go to the White House. And some of us said, no, you bring 1,000 people to the Capitol and you're lost. So So we went to this completely nondescript office building in Rockville, Maryland, and we took it over. And there were 1,000 people, and we were incredibly media savvy. So we were on the front page of every paper in the country and the lead story of the nightly news. After that demonstration, they returned our phone calls. And then the nature of the work changed, And then it was like, okay, now I've got to know my stuff and be able to sit at the table and have a discussion. Same thing with pharma, and some of us got arrested several times in the state of New Jersey because pharma wouldn't talk, So and they responded to the press. When we snuck onto the floor of the stock exchange and delayed the opening of the stock exchange by setting off foghorns and chaining ourselves to some banister, unfurling a sign saying, "Sell Burroughs Welcome." Burroughs Welcome responded to that media attention. 2 weeks later, the price of AZT came down. So that's where a lot of that, I think, came from. Oh, and just one other piece of it. The other piece of it that was vitally important was that we were really angry, and we needed to find ways to express our anger. And in many ways, we don't have time, but the demise of ACT UP was really about the need for people to personally express their anger outweighing being politically strategic.
Did you want to add anything to that, or should we close on the earth?
Seemed like a perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists here.